Testing, 1, 2. I think that works. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Works good.
Everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Powerful mic there. Okay, welcome back to our second afternoon presentation on talking Ozarks, Battles, and Ballads. We're going to head a little bit north this time into Missouri, or Missouri, whichever one.
That's right.
People are from different states sometimes, Missouri to Missouri. But I forgot to introduce myself at 2 o'clock. For those of you who don't know, that's how humble I am. I'm completely selfless at these things. But I'm Brooks Blevins, and I'm the Director of Regional Studies here at Lyon College. And it's good to have all of y'all here for this program. And I know we're in for another treat this afternoon. Our speaker now is Dr. William Garrett Piston. Dr. Piston holds the BA and MA degrees from Vanderbilt University and the PhD in history from the University of South Carolina. He has been a member of the History Department of Southwest Missouri State since 1988. He specializes in American military history and the Civil War and Reconstruction at SMS. Dr. Piston has authored 2 books, Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant, James Longstreet, and His Place in Southern History, and with co-author Richard Hatcher, Wilson's Creek, the Second Battle of the Civil War and the Men Who Fought It. Dr. Piston, whose scholarship has won awards from the Center for Studies in Military History and the State Historical Society of Missouri, is an associate editor for North and South Magazine and is active in a variety of local and national historical organizations. And this afternoon he's going to talk to us about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Let's welcome Dr. William Garrett Piston. It's a pleasure for me to be back in Batesville. I've had the pleasure to address your Civil Law Roundtable on a number of occasions, and it's always a lovely when I've been lucky. I don't think I've ever had to drive down here in bad weather. I've always caught it nice. It's been a really nice drive, and it was today. Pleasant and sunshine. I grew up in the mountains of East Tennessee, and I love to hit the curvy roads. It makes me feel like I'm heading home. Anytime I'm heading south, I feel like I'm heading home. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to, first of all, if anyone did not get the handout, I made some of those because I realized transparencies can be hard to see, but it is just a repeat of what's on here. In a minute or two, I'm going to show a couple of close-ups from a different map, and I thought it might help you because, unfortunately, the transparencies I'm going to show are from a work in progress, and it's not a great transparency. So I thought giving you something you could have right there in your hands so you weren't always peering at the screen might be a help. I'm going to talk about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Like all subjects, you know, where do you start, where do you end? You could go on and on and on. You could start with the very beginning of the Civil War of Missouri. Oops, well, maybe we ought to talk about Bleeding Kansas in 1854. So I could spend 2 hours just in background leading up to the battle. And then, like most people who fall in love with our subjects, as everyone you're going to hear in connection with this a wonderful conference has done, you just push a button and we could talk on and on and on. There's just not enough time. So the approach I've decided to take is, I call my talk Pandemonium Turned Loose. I want to give some idea of why I find this subject so fascinating. So I want to talk a little bit about the commanders, a little bit about the armies, then some of the events, not a complete blow-by-blow account, because even if I spent 2 hours on that, you could spend more than 2 hours discussing who was behind every tree, when this regiment went around that flank. So I want to give you a sense of the big picture of the battle. And then, if time allows, go into a little bit of detail about the dead and the wounded. The transparency I gave you is Xerox of the current handout brochure you get from the Wilson's Creek National Battlefield. How many of you have ever visited Wilson's Creek, been to the battlefield? Okay. A significant number, but not an absolutely huge number. This is their relatively new brochure. If you are not aware, the Wilson's Creek National Battlefield has been placed on the 10 most endangered list of Civil War battles. The bad news is a developer has brought property in the bottom left-hand corner of this sketch map. So everything in the bottom left-hand corner is going to be a subdivision within a year, and that will absolutely trigger it. And as you can see from this, it doesn't show everything. So there's a little bit on the left is already subdivision, so it doesn't show it. But to the south and to the right and to the north right now is all farmland. And you can just about kiss that goodbye, because the guy who sold his farm is making $7.5 million. Anyway, if you're interested in battlefield preservation, there are a million things, a million good places that need your money, but Wilson's Creek does too. If you're interested in helping preserve that, I belong to the Wilson's Creek National Battlefield Foundation, and if you'd like some information about helping us fight to preserve the battle, I'll be happy to talk with you after the talk. And it is a battlefield worth saving, as they all are, as they are locally here. Wilson's Creek fascinates me because it doesn't fit the well, in some ways, of course it does. It's a Civil War battle. It resembles other Civil War battles. We have images of the Civil War that come largely, I think, from Gettysburg. I know I can look out and just by looking at the ages of a lot of people here, and the color of your hair, we'll look at the color of mine, a lot of you lived through the Civil War centennial. And you remember the focus was so much on the East and Virginia, and the only thing that really happened outside Virginia was Gettysburg, wasn't it? You know, the war was fought in Virginia. We have our images of Pickett's charge and the soldiers in blue and gray, and what I like about Wilson's Creek is the way in which it doesn't fit many of those images. It's an early war battle, August 10th, 1861. And it fascinates me the way in which it either conforms to or is different from those images. First of all, a little bit about the cast of characters. It's a battle that pitted the Union commander, Nathaniel Lyon, and his Union army against a Southern army commanded by Ben McCulloch. And on the back side, I've given you a little bit of the McCulloch brochure that gives you just a brief biography of these people. But it would be hard to find a more interesting contrast in personalities. Nathaniel Lyon was a fiery New England West Pointer who, in his pre-war career in the United States Army, was noted as the toughest disciplinarian in the United States Army. This at a time where whipping was still a legal punishment. He got into trouble several times for abusing his own men. He did not like to use the word abolitionist to describe himself, but other people called him an abolitionist. He hated slavery with an absolute passion. People who knew him called him brilliant, but perhaps unbalanced, even mentally ill. He held Christianity in absolute contempt and laughed at people who were Christians. This at a time of a place, you know, when this was, you couldn't have a more egregious social faux pas than to do this. He believed that God worked through certain chosen individuals who had the mental ability to free themselves from the trappings of mythology and be God's instruments on the earth. And he believed he was God's instrument to punish secession, traitors, and slaveholders. And he did so in the state of Missouri in May by attacking a camp of the pro-secessionist Missouri State Militia camped outside St. Louis, by declaring war on the Missouri State Guard and the state government of Missouri and driving that Missouri State Guard back into the southwest corner of the state and assembling an army of 5,000 regulars and volunteers in the city of Springfield. It's a remarkable campaign. As I said, we could spend 2 hours talking about the things that just brought us up to that point. One of his interesting subordinates, time doesn't allow to go through the whole list, but it's the man that turns out to be key in understanding the Battle of Wilson's Creek is a subordinate named Franz Siegel. He was, as the name suggests, a German American. He'd grown up in Germany, had been educated at the German equivalent of West Point, the Karlsruhe Academy. He spoke 5 languages. He was a keen intellectual, and he was a St. Louis assistant school superintendent. He was the political leader of the German-American community in St. Louis and had been really crucial in getting the St. Louis Germans to switch their support from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. When Nathaniel Lyon believed he needed to take the initiative to save Missouri for the Union, to rally people in Missouri who were loyal to the Union, the German-American immigrant population was the natural one to tap into. St. Louis had a large foreign-born population, and an overwhelming majority of those German Americans detested slavery. Many of them were refugees from wars in Germany where they attempted unsuccessfully to establish democracy, and they supported the American experiment in democracy, and they turned out in large numbers when Lyon wanted volunteers. On the southern side of Wilson Street, as I said, you couldn't have a better contrast, is Ben McCulloch. Mild-mannered, unassuming, bearded Ben McCulloch. But don't ever rub a Texan the wrong way. Ben McCulloch, like many Texans of this generation, not born there, originally from Tennessee, he won fame in the Mexican War as a leader of the Texas Rangers, and continued with the Texas Rangers off and on up until the Civil War. He went to California looking for gold. He was commissioned a brigadier general in the Confederate Army, and from Fort Smith, Arkansas, he was interested in defending the Indian Territory in that particular era. Ben McCulloch was the genuine article. A lot of Davy Crockett was mythology pumped up by people writing books and articles. Ben McCulloch was the genuine frontiersman, the long rider, the tough plainsman. Mild-mannered, but absolutely tough as nails. He once broke a chair over the head of someone in the dining room in a Washington, D.C. restaurant. He was the commander on the southern side. Assisting him in a complex relationship I'll come back to in a minute was Sterling Price. Sterling Price commanded the Missouri State Guard, where McCulloch was average height, wiry, thin. Price was tall, portly, gray-haired, a little bit of a Santa Claus-like figure, bluff, hearty, a man who was absolutely beloved by his men with a great deal of charisma, successful politician. He had also fought in the Mexican War, where he'd been a leader of Missouri Volunteers and then won a commission as a brigadier general. He returned from the war a hero. He became a governor of Missouri, and when the war broke out, the government of Missouri chose him to be commander of the Missouri State Guard. So you have some very, very interesting personalities involved. Two sides fighting a battle. First of all, just very briefly, how and why they got there. As I said, Nathaniel Lyon pushed the Missouri State Guard back into the southwest corner of the state. The Missouri State Guard was the militia guaranteed to Missourians under the Second Amendment of the Constitution. The state of Missouri had not passed an ordinance of secession. In Missouri, the Civil War was more literally a civil war than any place else in the United States of America. Nathaniel Lyon, believing correctly that Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson and a large number of the leadership of the State Guard were scheming to take Missouri out of the Union. He was quite right. As I said, he unilaterally declared war on the government of Missouri, drove them down into the southwest corner of the state, down towards the area of Cassville, and at that point, Price came down to Missouri and tried to get General McCulloch to come up to Missouri. Price came down to Arkansas. And McCulloch got permission from Richmond to make common cause, to believe that the best way to defend Confederate Arkansas was to cross into Missouri, a state that had not left the Union, and help the folks there. So you have a very strange situation in which some Confederate troops from Arkansas crossed the border into Missouri, again, a state that had not passed an ordinance of secession, joined up with this Missouri State Guard at Cassville, and marched on Springfield, meaning to attack Lyon and his troops there. They stopped, where you see here, the actual creek itself may not show up too well in the transparency, but I think you can see it pretty well on the handout. You also can see, I hope, the historic Wire Road, the Telegraph Road, running from Springfield down to Fort Smith, Arkansas. They followed that road, the Telegraph Road, from Cassville on up, and they stopped at this particular place for two obvious reasons. One, you don't just blunder into your enemy and attack them without scouting their position. And two, if you're going to halt, you need to halt someplace where there's food and water. The combined forces of Price and McCulloch numbered 12,000 men, 2,000 of whom didn't have any arms. Each 1,000 men consumed 1.5 tons of food per day. Each 1,000 men, and there are 12,000 of them, ate 1.5 tons of food per day. Each horse, in order to stay healthy, and they had over 5,000 with them, needed 10 pounds of grain per day. This area was a rich agricultural region with about 100 different people living there. There were 5 different major springs. You could halt there, eat the food that was there, water your horses in the creek. The men could drink from the springs, and scouts would scout out Springfield and see if you're going to attack it. The Army consisted, as I said, of the Missouri State Guard. They made up some 7,000 of the troops that were present, but 2,000 of them had no weapons of any sort. The Missouri State Guard was a militia. It had been created as a response to political events in Missouri. Although it contained a few men wearing uniforms, the Missouri State Guard, if you could have photographed their appearance there at the battle, would not look remotely like anything that the image comes to those of us who grew up in or lived through the Civil War centennial, or who think of the war in terms of Gettysburg or Robert E. Lee or Jeb Stuart. The overwhelming majority of these 7,000 men were simply dressed in their civilian clothes. And the records are incomplete, but a large portion of them who did have weapons had weapons that were hunting weapons from home. A significant number of simply flintlock muskets. There were a few of the companies in the Missouri State Guard that did have uniforms that had been made by their loved ones very quickly, or they were pre-war militia units that had joined the Missouri State Guard. And in those circumstances, the colors blue and gray held no political significance whatsoever. It was August 1861, and yes, the United States Army did wear blue, but in the pre-war period, both blue and gray were popular colors for the militia. So you had in the Missouri State Guard people wearing civilian clothing of every description, people wearing blue uniforms, people wearing gray uniforms. Their flag, by the way, was just a simple blue banner with the state seal of Missouri on it. That was the Missouri State Guard. Coming up from Arkansas were really 2 different types of troops under the command of Ben McCulloch. First of all, he had a small brigade of Confederate troops who were like the Confederate troops that fought the entire war. They were volunteers. They'd been raised in different places. He had troops that were raised in Arkansas. He had troops that were raised in Louisiana, and he had troops that were raised in Texas. And these were people who later in the war would indeed resemble the image we think of, soldiers in gray uniforms. But these people too, although they were members of the Confederate Army, not a state militia, had not been able to receive uniforms from any Confederate government. It was early in the war, and they were wearing uniforms that were made by their loved ones at home, or simply civilian clothing. A large number of them were wearing gray, but they were also, some of them wore blue, some of them wore black. Within an individual unit, such as the Texans who fought here at Wilson's Creek, the different companies had 4 different colors, black, blue, gray, and brown, all within the same regiment. So not only are the regiments in the Army not in the same color, within each regiment there's no uniformity of color. They also had a wide variety and mixture of arms. They were much better armed than the Missouri State Guard, but they ranged from some of the latest technology, Colt's revolving rifles, down to flintlock muskets that were leftovers from the War of 1812. The second type of troops that were available to McCulloch and that he brought up from Arkansas were called Arkansas State Troops. They were militia. They were the militia guaranteed to the citizens of the state of Arkansas under the Confederate Constitution, because Arkansas had seceded from the Union, had joined the Confederacy. Its state constitution had a militia, and this was the militia. Arkansas State Troops, you find a variety of terms. Arkansas State Troops, Arkansas Militia, they mean the same thing. And these troops as well had been raised locally, and like the Missouri State Guard, they contained a bewildering variety of mixtures of colors, of clothing, of uniforms, weapons, and equipment. So we don't want to think of these people as merely an armed mob, because they were far more than that. The officers were busily trying to drill them and train them as much as they can. But the visual image would be very different. They would look, frankly, with their multicolored different uniforms, ranging from fancy to things that, well, the ladies meant well by this, to people just wearing their Sunday best. They frankly look a little bit more like armed Shriners than they would our image of parade ground soldiers of the Civil War. So, could you go back in a time machine and your only image of the Civil War is what you think of Gettysburg? You go to Wilson's Creek and go, what in the world is this group? Which side do they belong to? I don't have a clue. On the other side, the troops under Nathaniel Lyon's command, just under 6,000, they were also a mixture. He had a number of United States regulars, and those United States regulars were wearing the blue coats. They were wearing the traditional things that you see in all kinds of Civil War books. If you go out into the lobby, that wonderful display of books out there, and look at the photographs of the illustrations. The Union boy in blue, the regulars were indeed equipped that way. Lyon's forces, though, more than 80% of them were volunteers. Volunteers raised mostly in the St. Louis area. Those troops raised in the St. Louis area, again, a mixture. Some of them in civilian clothing, a lot of them wearing gray. Nothing seemed strange about that at the time. A lot of them wearing gray. There were some volunteers who had come over from Kansas. They'd been lucky enough to get at least one regiment of them got a total outfit of blue uniforms from the United States. They were able to pick these up apparently at Leavenworth. Another group of them, though, only got blue coats. So they all had a blue coat, but everything else they had on was civilian. So on the Union side, you'd see a significant mass of blue, but by no means a solid rank of blue. You'd see a lot of gray and a lot of civilian clothing as well. So it's an interesting battle because it so much defies our typical image of the Civil War. One reason I've gotten into this so much, I'm currently working on with Tom Sweeney in Springfield. We're working on a photographic history of the Civil War in Missouri. And the stuff people wore early in the war is amazing. It just defies your images. This organization there, this Southern Army, and you have to call it a Southern Army because only part of it's Confederate, they camped here at Wilson's Creek, was under Ben McCulloch's command by agreement. Sterling Price agreed to place himself under the command of Ben McCulloch because he wanted the Confederates' help in defending Missouri. He too, although he was initially reluctant in embracing secession, now believed that the Federal Army was the aggressor and that Missouri had no choice but to join the Confederacy. So it was a joint command. As I said, we call it a Southern Army rather than a Confederate Army, with the Confederate troops under McCulloch and the Missouri State Guard under Price. And they were camped in the valley of Wilson's Creek. Running up here, if you're looking at your handout here, up here at the top, their camp stretched from where the number 1 is there, not exactly where the 1 is, but the Gibson Mill site. They stretched all the way downstream to an area that is called the Sharp Stubble Field. They had camped in this particular area, as I said, to take advantage of the water, to water their horses. Some of the men had tents. So you would have seen some tents pitched in nice military streets, neat and clean. Some of the men had no tents whatsoever, had nothing. So they might have hacked down trees and stretched a blanket, made a little bit of a lean-to. Some of them didn't even have sufficient blankets and were crowded along the creek bed area, which was reasonably wooded. This particular handout shows you the current forestation at Wilson's Creek. And as you can see from the dark gray areas, there's a fair amount of heavy woods today. The park is in the process of restoring this. In 1861, almost all of this was waist-high prairie grass with just a few scrub oaks, different thickets, but most of this was waist-high prairie grass, and the only places that it would have had significant woods would have been along the trees itself. So as I said, they had camped there to take advantage of the food and water in order to scout things out. Part of the reason for Ben McCulloch's caution in not wanting to just rush at Springfield and attack precipitously was not just that he, needs to find out, well, how many enemy is there, if they put up any defenses. His army had only 25 rounds a man on average. A few units more ammunition, and a couple of them less. But 25 rounds per man. Well, don't have time for a detour lecture about how Civil War weapons work. And some of you in the audience here may be gun collectors and know 10 times more about Civil War weapons than I do. The key point here is that the soldiers could shoot, even a poorly trained soldier with very little experience could fire one shot a minute easily. So 25 rounds if you're engaged in heavy combat. The point is, it would be very easy for the Southern Army to run out of ammunition in an hour's worth of fighting if it wasn't very, very careful. So that helps explain McCulloch's caution. It turns out it helps explain a lot about the course of the battle as well. Another reason the battle is fascinating is it doesn't go like you would expect. 12,000 Southerners camped there, 2,000 of them without any arms whatsoever. They were the numerically superior side. They knew it. They didn't know by precisely how much. Each side, as is so typical in Civil War battles, greatly overestimates the size of the enemy forces. But they knew Lyon's force in Springfield was at least smaller than theirs. Nathaniel Lyon had managed to gather, actually a total camped in the Springfield vicinity, was about 7,000 men. But he had a lot of problems. Those, his regulars, he could count on them. But a lot of the volunteers had enlisted for very short periods of time, and their enlistments were expiring. In fact, in the 8 weeks leading up to this campaign, about a third of Nathaniel Lyon's army left. So he was down to about 7,000. Men who had enlisted at a time when everyone assumed the war was going to be over literally within 90 days. And so he faced a dilemma, what to do. Literally within the next 2 or 3 weeks, half of that 7,000 men, their enlistments would be up. What to do? Well, his boss told him what to do. His boss, who just arrived, they just appointed a bigwig in St. Louis. His boss was John C. Freeman, famous pathfinder of the pre-Civil War period, with lots of political connections to the city of St. Louis. And Freeman had been given the assignment of opening up the Mississippi River Valley, which of course the Union would eventually do, with campaigns ranging from Island Number 10 and Port Hudson to the famous Battle at Vicksburg. Eventually the Union Army would do that, and most scholars have agreed that was a very wise strategy. So for Fremont, anything happening in the Ozarks, anything happening down around Springfield, was a sideshow. Yes, the Union wanted to reassert control over 100% of the state of Missouri, but it's the job of the top commander to set priorities, and every man was needed. And he told Lyon, your troops, enlistment's running out, you're a little short on food, you simply ought to pull back. Pull back up to Rolla, where the nearest rail connection is, and I can use your troops to support my campaign against the Mississippi. Again, from the orders that Fremont had been given, this made absolute sense. But Lyon, as I said, believed passionately that he had been appointed by God to punish traitors. He had already secured let me switch maps here briefly. In his campaign, before pushing the State Guard back down into the left-hand corner of Missouri, he'd secured the Missouri River. He'd secured the railroads you see on that state. And those were really the most important areas in Missouri from a military point of view. Also, because it was in the rich river bottoms that you could grow hemp and tobacco profitably, that's where slavery was concentrated in Missouri. That's actually where most of the secessionist sentiment was, there and along the border. He'd really secured the areas he needed to most. So again, to withdraw temporarily back up to Rolla, we can see why he would be given such orders. But Lyon took it very personally. Down in the Ozarks, there was a great deal of Unionist sentiment. And Lyon was pleased and flattered by the support he got in Springfield. And he genuinely and sincerely did not want to leave these people behind, people who had come out and supported his army. And he feared what would happen to the people in southwest Missouri, how they would suffer reprisals. So it was partly personal, it was partly political. From his point of view, have to do something. And what he decided to do was to fight. Even though knew he was outnumbered, he decided he had to fight. He needed to uphold the prestige of Union arms. He would attack the enemy and surprise them. Do the thing they would least expect. The smaller side usually doesn't attack in military history. But if he could catch them by surprise, at the very least he could stun them. And that way he could move safely back to Rolla. Because it's easy for Fremont to say, well, just pull out and come back to Rolla. But Lyon did have the smaller army. The enemy had pushed up aggressively towards Springfield. They had a lot of cavalry. He was afraid if he tried to march back to Rolla without a fight, they might overtake him and make him fight someplace at his disadvantage. Better to choose the time and place of the battle. Well, it was a daring plan. Particularly daring because at the last minute, Lyon decided to modify it. The original plan was simply, all right, the enemy's dangerous, they're close by, they're so close by, if we try and move, they might grab us before we can do something. We're going to have to punch them in the nose, stun them. See some sense in that. But at the last minute, he changed his plan. Franz Sigel suggested to Lyon, switch maps again, that even though they had the smaller force, they should divide their forces and attack the enemy from two directions. Not to come the direction anyone would expect, which would be down the Wire Road, from that direction, but instead have Lyon move overland and attack more or less due north, while Sigel, making a long march, would attack from the south. And if you can see there at the top my little hand-drawn L, that's where Lyon entered the fight. And now down in the right-hand corner of your map, or if you can see it here, it's kind of low, the S, that's where Sigel entered the fight. A daring plan to move at night and attack simultaneously at dawn. But if they could do this, it might be possible not just to stun the enemy, but win a tremendous victory. Why Lyon accepted this plan has been a source of great controversy. Since Lyon was killed during the battle, his reasons for doing so were never written down. His other subordinates gave conflicting accounts about that, and so it's simply not clear. Lyon's most recent biographer, Christopher Phillips, puts it down to personality, that Lyon really wanted to punish the enemy, and when offered a chance to not just stun them, but offer a potentially crippling defeat upon them, he simply could not do so. Some sources indicate that Sigel actually threatened him to withdraw the support of the German-American community if Lyon was not willing to change the plan and give him a starring role in the battle. That tale comes from Sigel's enemies after the fact, so you need to take it with a bit of caution. I side with Professor Phillips that it's probably Lyon's ego more than anything else. In any case, it does result in one of the almost unusual battles of the Civil War, with an army that is smaller being divided and attacking the enemy from both sides and achieving surprise successfully, a dawn attack. It was about 10 minutes to 5 in the morning, 5 minutes to 5, just about dawn at August 10th, when Lyon approached the battlefield where you see the L, and Sigel had reached his position. They had managed to move in secret and completely surprise the enemy. Sigel's position was a bit of high ground. You can see site of Sigel's first position there. It's heavily wooded now, but at the time, although there were some woods along the ridge, there was an open spot there, and local farm roads had brought him to that spot. They managed to get into position and open fire. Sigel could look down upon the Sharp farm, the Sharp cornfield, and the Sharp stubble field, had an excellent platform, elevated platform for his attack. Lyon, as he entered the battlefield, approached a piece of ground that was soon nicknamed during the day, no one knows precisely by whom, Bloody Hill. This piece of ground, to the best of my knowledge, had no name whatsoever among the local farmers. It was simply a hill. And it included, if you look here, you can see where the tour road goes. and you can see Wilson's Creek. It included everything west of Wilson's Creek, but not just the stuff that's inside the tour road. Bloody Hill continued outside of the park boundaries, that you see them on the left. And you see these city streets over here to the left. Bloody Hill goes all the way over there above Schuler Creek. So it's actually a very, very big hill. It's not very high, and it's broad and full of undulations. You can get enough of a sense from this map to get a sense that, yeah, there's some undulations there. What Lyon planned to do was come across that broad hill and then fire down upon the enemy in the creek. As it turns out, the battle did not go as anybody expected. It began going amazingly well, in part for the Union, and it turned out being something very much approaching a disaster. The Southerners were caught completely by surprise. Lyon, as he approached, actually ran into a small group of Southerners just about an inch to the left of where it says Tour Road, below my L there. That's a little rise of ground. It's part of Bloody Hill. You can get a little sense from the shading that that's a little bit of a higher ground. So he first encountered a group of Southerners there who had moved out. There was some wild rumor. Some people had been out foraging without permission. They'd gone out looking for food without their officer's permission. And they came back with these wild tales that there were all these Yankees approaching them. It's just dawn, just barely light enough to see. So their local commander, who happened to be camped down there at the Gibson Mill site, said, oh, this is probably nothing, but told one of his subordinates, mount up your men, ride out there and see what's up there. And they had just gotten to that high ground when Lyon came into view. So it actually begins as a bit of an encounter battle there on that ground that will become known as Bloody Hill. Lyon pushed those troops aside quite easily because he had a superiority of numbers at that point. He had taken, they brought to the battlefield just under 6,000 men, and he had 2/3 of them, Sigel with about 1/3 of them. And they were able to push over onto this unnamed northern spur here, this little bit of high ground, very easily. And as Lyon looked ahead, he could see this hilltop that again was broad and flat and covered mostly with prairie grass. Looking out to his left, he could look over into the Gibson house site, the oat field, the Ray cornfield. These were visible to him, and he knew that the wire road, and he could see this farm called the Ray house. He could see that in the distance. He decided that he'd better send someone over in that direction to protect his flank. So he dispatched one of his subordinates named Plummer, and his goal was to cross the creek, move over, and secure the wire road somewhere in the vicinity of the Ray house. Because of this, we can summarize the battle very quickly in saying it took part in really 3 phases. What Sigel did down south, Lyon's engagement that takes place on top of Bloody Hill, and what turns out to be a little bit of a sideshow over in the Ray cornfield. And I want to talk about each of those in not exhaustive detail, but just give you an idea of what occurred. And I'm going to share with you some sketch maps that are a little more detailed than this. They're not great. They're maps that I'm doing in a work on preparation. It's going to be a tour guide to Wilson's Creek. And what I've got here right now is transparencies or just some sketches I've sent off to the guy that will actually do the professional maps. So I'll just show you 2 or 3 of these, and I hope they don't end up confusing you. This is, you can see Ray cornfield. Well, obviously, okay, it's not the same map I've given you. You can see the outlines of the fence, and you can match it with yours and say, okay, I can see southern part of Ray cornfield. This map has topographical lines in it, so it's very, very busy. I apologize, it doesn't make the best transparency. But to send off to the publisher. And what will appear on the book page is inside the black border. So literally, this is a work in progress, although you get to see it first, so hopefully That sneak peek will make up for its rough character. But Ben McCulloch learned of these troops approaching the wire road. Ben McCulloch and Sterling Price were having breakfast down at the Edwards cabin, which is in the center of the map I've handed out to you, and is going to be, for the first time, going to be restored in the park. Is now working on that and is developing that site for interpretation. They were having breakfast there, and initially did not hear anything from the initial fighting up on the northern spur there. There's a dispute as to exactly how many minutes go by when they don't hear anything. Literally just the height of the hill, though it's not that great, prevented them from hearing anything. Was it 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or 30 minutes? The counts differ, and that's part of the challenges of trying to sort out what happened. I don't think it was more than 20 minutes, probably, when they first get word from a runner who says, there's some action up there in the north. No, I don't think, we don't believe that sort of tale. And then someone else comes, a second runner, and says, hey, we're busy fighting the Yankees up there. And then soon they start hearing the booming of the cannon and say, better do something. At that point, Ben McCulloch tells Price to get the State Guard out of its camps. The State Guard had camped west, or to the left of the creek, as it's on your map, whereas McCulloch's Confederate Brigade had camped to the right. And each man simply started getting the troops closest in camp to the scene of danger and started shoving them towards the scene of danger. While Price was pushing men towards Bloody Hill, we'll come back to that very quickly, McCulloch took some of the Confederate troops, including Arkansans, and sent them up towards here to take care of this. They simply knew that there were Federals coming in the vicinity. They did not know exactly where. When they got to the Ray house, there was a trail leading off to the left, down past the spring house that the farmers used, that the Ray family used to get to their well water. And they simply hung a left there off the road, past the spring house, and were moving up to the cornfield when the Federals came into view. And this sketch map gives you an idea of that encounter. Literally, as they were moving in and trying to take up a position, the shortage of space caused them to spill over and bend their line at an angle. It turned out to be wonderful. They didn't plan it this way, but when they opened fire, they were able to take the Federals on the flank and deliver a devastating fire on them. The fight here lasted about half an hour before the Federals gave way and were pushed back. They ran back to the Gibson Mill site. The Confederates followed them for a significant period of time until they came under fire from some of Lyon's artillery on top of Bloody Hill, and they pulled back as well. That turned out then to be rather a sideshow. Lyon's men had failed in their mission to secure the wire road, but the Southerners, who could be fired upon by Lyon's artillery on Bloody Hill, made no attempt to turn his flank. So the course of the battle really depended upon what happened on Bloody Hill and what happened with Sigel. And what Sigel did at first was flat out amazing. He, at dawn, opened a bombardment on the 1,500 men or so who were camped in the Sharp stubble field and Sharp cornfield, and they ran away in an absolute panic. Just absolutely ran away, and by best estimates, half of them never took any part in the battle again. So it was amazing. He then moved down off that hill and started to approach the Sharp farmhouse. When he got there, when he got to about part way, he saw some of the enemy switch back here. When he got to part way, he saw that some of the enemy was rallying, so he set up his guns in the middle of the Sharp cornfield, the Sharp stubble field, opened fired on them and drove them away. But eventually he reached the Sharp farm and took up a position there. And he took up a position, and he could see the fighting on Bloody Hill, which of course we haven't gotten back to yet, but you can see, if you just see where it says Sigel's final position, and look straight up on your paper and imagine setting up artillery, that you could fire in that direction. And for about half an hour he did. But remember what I said about the colors not meaning anything? and a lot of people on both sides in civilian clothing. He was afraid, and rightly so. He saw waist-high prairie grass. He saw people moving around. The Civil War guns caused lots of white smoke. There was not a breath of air. It was a hot, awful August, so all the smoke hung in the air. Oh, friendly, I better stop. Didn't notice. Freddie might hit his own men. That makes sense. Up to this point, everything Siegel had done made a great deal of sense. From the moment he ceased fire, though, everything he did was wrong. He did nothing to tell Lyon what he had done, where he had arrived, and that he had taken up a position in the rear of the enemy. Even though Siegel's forces included some cavalrymen who could have been sent off in a mission to locate Lyon. I mean, you know, that's part of what you do, is you risk a few privates' lives for the sake of communication in warfare. So he'd reached a stunning position. He'd driven part of the enemy away. He was on the wire road in the rear of the enemy's position. And he'd fired a few shots in their rear. Then he'd call things off. But he made no attempt to investigate what was in front of him, to find out if it was friend or foe. He simply went on the defensive and then positioned himself badly. This close-up map represents the sharp team in such wonderful places, and if we lose them to development, we'll never get them back. Thank you.
We do have time for a question or two.
I ran a little long.
That's okay. If anybody has any questions?
Near Eastford, Connecticut, in a family burial plot. So he was taken back. Taken across, got a lot of attention. He was the first Union general to die in combat. So he crossed the country in a train draped in black, very much presaging what would be done with Lincoln. And got a lot of attention. He'd stop in the city and his body would lie in state and be mourned, and then put it back on the train. He's a general who is now almost completely forgotten, but this Wilson's Creek and Lyon's death were national news of the first order in 1861.
I'm just going to stress what you said about pristine. Wilson Creek and also Prairie Grove, you won't find battlefields in the park system that are as close as they were to the time of the battle. That cornfield, my wife's people all lived down there. 50 years ago, that was a cornfield. It had been a cornfield since the war. Now, the parks made sure they kept it that way, but it was that way anyway. There had been absolutely no development on that park, just like Pea Ridge was pretty much the same thing. So you need to go see it before it's covered over. There's a high school. You didn't miss. There's a high school going in just north of the park too. New high school. It's just going to be completely covered here if they don't.
And if you've been to Pea Ridge lately and see what's happening in the Springdale area, Bentonville, you know, I've been here 16 years. I can't believe what I've seen. People who are natives there tell me it's just beyond belief. So both battlefields are severely threatened. They both right now have farmland around them, but within 2 years, that may not be true of either. Well, Pea Ridge has got some mountainous areas that probably is. Other question? Yes, sir.
Did you mention a bit about firearms and interchangeability of ammunition besides, I guess, regiments within the South?
This was an early war battle, and it was rare to find a regiment where every man possessed the same type of gun. Only in the United States regulars do I know with a certainty that you had a unit that everybody has the same type of weapon. We don't have details for every regiment, so there's some regiments where I just have to say, we don't know what they carry. But where we have records, the story is that even within the regiments, there's no standardization. As I said, the Texans carried everything from Colt's revolving rifles down to flintlocks. The 3rd Louisiana had everything from flintlocks to Springfield. So they had different types of ignition systems. They had different calibers. So the ammunition would be different within the regiment. So there were well over a dozen different calibers used on each side. And this has been supported, by the way, by archaeological study, which they've done a good job of. So it's an amazing, no other battlefield except Pea Ridge, and there it's less, but it's also noticeable. Is there such an astonishing range of calibers of weapons, from a lot of outdated things that clearly came from arsenals, things that are 69 caliber, that are old smooth bores from the War of 1812 or from the Mexican War. So a lot of that has been found, and they describe the soldiers who issued these things, and they go, one soldier comments, oh, well, did the sentry for Noah's Ark have this gun? It's so old. He made a joke, surely if anyone posted a guard on Noah's Ark, this is the gun they gave him, because it's that old. On the Union side, the same problem, not as bad, but also in those volunteer regiments, even one like the 1st Iowa, which was well equipped with several companies, had modern weapons. Others of them had old, outdated smooth bores that they just detested. So everything from rifled weapons, the most modern military, to hunting rifles, squirrel rifles, shotguns for duck hunting, all that sort of thing. A follow-up, or did that?
We'll have one more question.
This is not a question, this is just a comment. The first casualty in Batesville was Joe Neal, who was killed in the Battle of Wilson.
You know which unit he was with?
What unit he was with?
Captain Gill.
1st Arkansas? 1st Arkansas Mounted Rifles? Yeah, the Confederate unit, not Arkansas State Troops, yes.
I'll just make one comment. I'm surprised last year I was giving a talk about something, and a woman in the audience spoke up and said, well, Lyon College was named after General Nathaniel Lyon. And if you think that, you are badly mistaken. I just want to point out that Lyon College is not named in honor of a Yankee general.
Now.
Very much a Southern family that Lyon College was named for, but apparently some people think that. Some people who know just enough about the history of Arkansas and Missouri to be dangerous. But I want to invite all of you back at 7 o'clock. We'll have another good talk about the Civil War in the Arkansas Ozarks from Dr. Thomas DeBlack from Arkansas Tech University. The University of Arkansas Press will have copies of his books that I'm sure he would be glad to sign before or after his talk. And I encourage you to, we don't have copies, unfortunately, of Dr. Piston's Wilson's Creek book.
Brought two with me.
Okay, if anybody's interested, he's got 2 copies, and I'm sure he'd be glad to sign those for you. And you can get those from the University of North Carolina Press. I think it's North Carolina. Is that?
The best press, you ought to know, they published your book. Of course they're the best press.
Don't want to hear Tom.
No, Arkansas is the best press, of course.
Right.
We're weenies for going to North Carolina.
Yeah, that's the only press here, so we better not.
Only Arkansas.
But you have seen the good.
They're publishing my photographic history, raw Arkansas.
They do some excellent photographic history on the Civil War stuff,
Yeah.
and we have some of that
Big
out there.
fan of
But
Arkansas.
invite everybody back 7 o'clock tonight. Thomas DeBlack and Ozark Music tomorrow. Thanks a lot for coming, and back at.